The government of Colombia and the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, are working hard to reach a final peace agreement to end the longest-running armed conflict in Latin America. And just back in September, they agreed to place a deadline of March of 2016 after plenty of years of negotiations. At least since 2012, they've been negotiating in Cuba. And back in September, the president of Colombia flew to Cuba to announce that they have reached to an agreement to reach the deadline of March 2016, Nick. Now we know that a senior FARC negotiator, Jesus Santrich, said that that won't be the case, that they won't be signing anything at this deadline because the government of Colombia has been changing the rules. Right after they signed this and they did this big ceremony right before election time in Colombia, the government came back to the negotiation table and said, well, really this is not a whole agreement that we signed on, this is just covering few of the items of the agenda. The two sticking points in the agenda, one is the victim reparations, and the other one is the disarmament and demobilization of the FARC. But we do see that this is something that the people from Colombia are desperately in need of, a healing. After 5 decades of armed conflict, we are talking back in '64, the revolution started, and since then the FARC has relied on kidnapping, drug trafficking, another type of crime to fund their insurgency.
And it's a shame because if you go back to September, I mean, just look at that picture. People really had high hopes for the future, and they were really excited, and they were very optimistic. At the same time, it might not be all that surprising. But I have to say, we can't, blame just one side. I think both are to blame. If we're talking about, coming together as a whole, because the government definitely had a different attitude, knowing that, elections were coming up very soon. But, we still have to stay optimistic because we've seen huge gains at the same time. Correct. I mean, look, I just did a story this week on Hector Albedis Bitrago, who was this medic for the FARC, at least they called him the medic, and what he was doing these forced abortions on the female fighters so that they could continue fighting as opposed to leaving and becoming mothers. So, I mean, that was a huge thing. He fled to Spain when he found out that the government was after him, and now the Colombian government's looking to get him extradited back, and I think him being now in Spanish custody, and he probably will get sent back soon, is a huge step forward. So there are good things happening too. But look, like I said, we can't be all that surprised because if we're talking about, the one thing that's keeping us from, or keeping the Colombian people is coming together finally is the fact that they don't want to, basically admit for all the crazy atrocities that went down, the war crimes and everything else, because that's essentially, it's like, how are we going to pay back the victims? How are we going to reintegrate you back into society? You can't do that without basically admitting to all the war crimes you've committed.
We're talking about 220,000 people that died in this conflict since the beginning of it in the 60s. 5 million people in Colombia have been displaced because of this. And part of the negotiation is the establishment of an alternative judiciary system just to judge the guerrilla members that created this type of crimes, that committed these crimes. But at the same time, we face a situation where the people of Colombia are eager to see the end to this long-running conflict, and many of them also want to have a feeling of justice for those relatives and family members that have died or suffered in this conflict. They also want to see some justice served, and that's exactly what they're trying to come to an agreement in between the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the government of Colombia.